Jessie was 27 when she met a guy named Mark at her local gym. He was tall, fit, and had that easygoing charm that made him stand out from the rest. After a few casual conversations at the gym, Mark asked Jessie out for coffee. They hit it off, chatting about hiking trails, fitness goals, and their shared love for the outdoors. So, when Mark suggested they go on a hike for their first real date, Jessie didn't think twice. He promised to take her to a scenic cabin deep in the woods, a hidden spot he said most people didn't know about. Jessie loved the idea of getting off the beaten path. She considered herself adventurous, and Mark seemed like the perfect guide. On the day of the date, Jessie dressed for the hike. Lightweight clothes, sturdy boots, and a small backpack with water and snacks. Mark picked her up in his SUV, and they drove out of town toward the trailhead. The ride was pleasant enough, with Mark playing upbeat music and cracking jokes. But as they got closer to their destination, the paved roads gave way to gravel paths, and Jessie noticed there weren't any other cars around. It was just them, heading deeper into the woods. She brushed off her unease, convincing herself it was just nerves. After all, Mark seemed like a nice guy. When they arrived at the trailhead, Jessie hopped out of the car, excited to stretch her legs. The forest was dense, with towering trees blocking out most of the sunlight. The trail wasn't well marked, but Mark seemed to know exactly where he was going. As they walked, he pointed out different plants and landmarks, keeping the conversation light. But after about 30 minutes, Jessie started to notice little things that made her uneasy. Mark avoided personal questions. He didn't talk about his family, his job, or even where he was from. Anytime Jessie asked, he'd steer the conversation back to her, asking about her life instead. She thought it was odd, but didn't push it. They were still getting to know each other after all. After hiking for nearly an hour, they finally reached the cabin. But it wasn't what Jessie expected. Instead of a charming, rustic getaway, the cabin looked wrong. The wooden exterior was weathered and rotting. The windows were boarded up, and there was an unsettling smell in the air, like damp wood mixed with something metallic. Jessie wrinkled her nose but kept her thoughts to herself. Mark unlocked the door with an old rusty key, pushing it open with a loud creak. "Here it is," he said with a grin. Jessie stepped inside, her boots crunching on the dusty floor. The cabin was dark and musty, with random junk scattered everywhere. Old furniture, boxes, and even a broken toilet sitting in the corner. It was clear no one had used the place in a long time. Jessie's eyes scanned the room, landing on something that made her blood run cold. Polaroid photos covered one wall, tacked up in uneven rows. At first, she couldn't make out what they were, but as she stepped closer, her stomach twisted in horror. The photos were of women, different women, all of them tied to chairs, their faces streaked with tears, mouths gagged with cloth. Some looked terrified, others defeated. Jessie's mind raced. This wasn't some charming little cabin getaway. It was something else entirely. Something dark. Mark's voice pulled her out of her thoughts. "You like the photos?" he asked, his tone calm. Jessie turned to see him standing by the door, blocking the only exit. "You're my favorite one yet," he said, his smile never reaching his eyes. Jessie's heart began to pound as she stood frozen in front of the wall of Polaroids. Her mind was racing, trying to process what she was seeing. The women in the photos, their terrified expressions, and now Mark's strange, cold smile. She forced herself to keep calm, not wanting to show any fear. What is this?" she asked, her voice shaking despite her best efforts. Mark took a step closer, still standing between her and the door. "Memories," he said casually, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. "I like to document my adventures." Jessie's stomach twisted in knots. Adventures. That's what he was calling this. She took a slow step backward, pretending to look at the photos more closely to buy herself time. Her mind screamed at her to think, to come up with a plan. The photos weren't just random, they were trophies. Mark took another step closer. "I knew you were different," he continued. "The second I saw you at the gym, I knew you'd be fun. I don't usually go for women like you, too smart, too cautious. But I couldn't resist." Jessie's hands trembled as she reached for her phone in her pocket, trying to do it discreetly. But Mark noticed. His eyes darkened and his smile faded. "Looking for your phone?" he asked, tilting his head. "You won't get a signal out here." He was right. Jessie glanced at the screen. No service. Her pulse quickened. She needed to get out of there, and fast. She took a deep breath and forced a nervous laugh. "Okay, this is weird," she said, trying to sound casual. "But I'm guessing this is some kind of joke, like a prank or something?" Mark chuckled softly. "A joke? Sure, you can think of it that way." He leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. "But you're not leaving. Not yet." Jessie's heart felt like it might explode. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape. The windows were boarded up. The door was blocked by Mark. There was no way out, unless she made one. Mark stepped closer, closing the distance between them. Jessie instinctively took a step back, bumping into a dusty table. Her hand brushed something cold and metal, a broken lantern. Without thinking, she grabbed it and swung it at Mark with all her strength. The lantern hit him square in the shoulder, making him stumble backward. "Screw you!" he growled, clutching his arm. Jessie didn't wait. She bolted toward the door, shoving past him as he tried to regain his balance. She burst outside, the cool forest air hitting her like a slap to the face. But she didn't stop. She ran. Jessie sprinted down the trail, her boots pounding against the dirt path. The trees blurred past her, and her breath came in ragged gasps. She didn't dare look back. She could hear Mark shouting behind her, his footsteps crashing through the underbrush. "Jessie, you're only making this worse!" he yelled. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. Her survival instincts kicked in, and all that mattered was putting as much distance as possible between her and that cabin. The trail twisted and turned, disorienting her. The sun was setting, and darkness was creeping in fast. Shadows stretched across the forest floor, making it harder to see. Jessie's lungs burned, but she pushed herself to keep going. She knew Mark was still behind her. She could hear him, getting closer with every step. Her mind raced through her options. She couldn't outrun him forever. She needed to hide. Up ahead, she spotted an old hunting cabin nestled between the trees. It looked just as run down as the first cabin, but it was her only chance. She darted toward it, yanking the door open and slipping inside. The cabin was dark and smelled of mildew. Jessie quickly barricaded the door with a heavy wooden beam and backed away, her heart pounding in her chest. She grabbed an old, dusty radio from a shelf and fumbled with the knobs, praying it still worked. Static crackled through the speakers. Come on," she whispered, turning the dials. Finally, a voice came through the static. "Hello? Who's there?" Jessie's voice trembled as she spoke. "Please, I need help. There's someone after me." The voice on the other end was gruff but steady. "Lock the door. Stay inside. He's still out there." Jessie's blood ran cold. "How do you know?" she whispered. The line went dead. Jessie stood frozen in the dark hunting cabin, clutching the old radio in her trembling hands. The man on the other end had warned her to lock the door, but she'd already done that. Her mind was racing. Who was he? How did he know Mark was still out there? And why did the line suddenly go dead? The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint rustling of leaves outside. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she strained to hear anything. Footsteps, movement, anything that would tell her Mark was near. Then from outside, she heard it. A slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps on the gravel path leading to the cabin. Jessie's heart stopped. She clutched the radio tighter, backing away from the door. The footsteps were steady, unhurried, like whoever was outside knew exactly where she was and wasn't in a rush. The cabin was pitch dark, except for the faint moonlight filtering through the cracks in the walls. She held her breath, hoping whoever was out there would pass by. But deep down, she knew it was him. "Jessie?" Her blood turned to ice. Mark's voice echoed through the night, calm and casual, as if they were still on a friendly hike together. "I know you're in there." Jessie backed into a corner, her mind screaming at her to think. There had to be another way out. A window, a back door, anything. But the cabin was old and sealed tight. She was trapped. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. Mark's shadow loomed against the cracked wooden panels, and Jessie could see his outline through the gaps. He was standing perfectly still, just on the other side. "You can come out, you know," he said, his tone playful. "I'm not mad. I just want to talk." Jessie pressed her back against the wall, trying to steady her breathing. She needed to stay quiet. She needed to stay hidden. But then she heard a sound that made her heart sink. The soft jingle of keys. Mark chuckled. "Oh, right. I've got the key to this one, too." Jessie's mind screamed at her to move. She ran to the window, clawing at the wooden boards covering it. They wouldn't budge. Behind her, the sound of the key sliding into the lock sent a wave of panic through her. The door creaked open slowly, the heavy wooden beam scraping against the floor as Mark pushed it aside. Jessie turned just in time to see him step into the cabin, his silhouette framed by the moonlight outside. "There you are," he said softly, closing the door behind him. Jessie grabbed the closest thing she could find, an old, rusty knife left on the table. She held it out in front of her, hands shaking. Mark took a step closer, his eyes locked on hers. "What are you going to do with that?" he asked, smirking. "You're not going to hurt me." Jessie tightened her grip on the knife. "Stay back," she said, her voice trembling. Mark shook his head, laughing softly. "You don't get it, do you? There's no way out." He took another step closer. "No one knows you're here. No one's coming to save you. It's just you and me." Jessie's mind raced. She had to do something, anything, to get out of this. Without thinking, she lunged forward, slashing the knife toward Mark. He jumped back, his smirk fading into a scowl. "Bad move!" he growled. Before Jessie could react, Mark charged at her. She stumbled backward, crashing into the table, knocking over the radio. The static crackled to life again, and for a brief moment, Jessie heard the man's voice once more. "Run!" Jessie didn't hesitate. She kicked Mark in the shin, hard, and bolted for the door. He stumbled, cursing under his breath, but she didn't stop. She threw the door open and ran into the night. The forest was pitch black now, the moonlight barely breaking through the thick canopy of trees. Jessie ran blindly, her heart pounding in her chest. Behind her, she could hear Mark's footsteps crashing through the underbrush. "You can't run forever, Jessie!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the trees. Jessie's lungs burned, but she pushed herself harder. Her only hope was to reach the main road and flag down a car. But the trail twisted and turned, disorienting her. Every direction looked the same in the dark. Suddenly, she heard something that made her blood run cold. The sound of an engine. A car, number a white van. The same van she had seen parked near the cabin earlier. Its headlights remained off as it rolled slowly down the dirt path, cutting off any chance of escape. Jessie's mind screamed at her to keep moving. She darted into the trees, hoping to lose Mark in the dense forest. Her heart pounded in her ears as she weaved between the trees, branches scraping her arms and face. Behind her, Mark's voice rang out again. "Jessie, it's pointless. Just give up." But she didn't stop. She couldn't. Her only option now was to survive. Jessie's lungs burned as she sprinted through the forest, the dense trees closing in around her. Branches clawed at her arms and face, and the only sound she could hear was the pounding of her own heartbeat. Mark's footsteps crashed through the underbrush behind her, relentless and unyielding. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." Mark's voice echoed through the trees, cold and impatient. "Just stop running, Jessie. You can't keep this up forever." She ignored him, forcing herself to keep going, her legs screaming in protest. The forest seemed endless, a dark maze with no clear way out. Jessie's mind raced as she tried to remember the way back to the main road, but everything looked the same in the dark. Then, up ahead, she saw it, a faint outline of another cabin. This one was smaller, more decrepit, barely standing upright. It looked abandoned, but it was her only chance. Jessie didn't hesitate. She ran straight for the cabin, shoving open the door and stumbling inside. The interior was dark and musty, the air thick with the smell of decay. Jessie quickly slammed the door shut behind her, sliding an old wooden beam across it to barricade it. Her hands trembled as she backed away from the door, listening for any sound outside. Silence. For a moment, she allowed herself to breathe, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. But the quiet didn't last long. Tap, tap, tap. Her blood ran cold. The sound was soft at first, barely audible, but it grew louder with each tap. It was coming from the window. Jessie turned slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. There, through the cracked glass, she saw him. Mark. His face was pale in the moonlight, his expression twisted into a sinister grin. He tapped on the window again, the sound echoing through the small cabin. "Jessie," he called softly. "Come on, let's not drag this out." Jessie backed away from the window, her mind racing. She needed a plan. She glanced around the cabin, searching for anything she could use as a weapon. There was an old hunting knife on a dusty shelf, rusted but still sharp. She grabbed it, clutching it tightly in her shaking hands. "I know you're scared," Mark said, his voice calm and soothing. "But you don't have to be. This can end right now. All you have to do is open the door." Jessie clenched her teeth, gripping the knife tighter. "Stay away from me!" she shouted, her voice cracking with fear. Mark's grin widened. "Why are you fighting this? We had such a good time earlier, didn't we? It's just you and me out here, Jessie. No one's coming to save you." Jessie's phone buzzed in her pocket, making her jump. She pulled it out with shaking hands, hoping for a signal. But there was nothing. No bars, no way to call for help. Then she saw the message. It was from an unknown number. "He's lying. Don't open the door." Her heart skipped a beat. She stared at the message, her mind reeling. Who sent that? How did they know what was happening? The phone buzzed again. "Stay hidden. Help is coming." Jessie's breath caught in her throat. Could she trust it? Was it a trick? Mark's voice broke through her thoughts. "Jessie, you're wasting time." Suddenly, the sound of wood splintering filled the air. Mark was kicking at the door, trying to break it down. Bam! Jessie backed away, clutching the knife tightly. Bam! The door shook under the force of his kicks. The wooden beam holding it shut was starting to crack. Bam! With one final kick, the door burst open, the wooden beam snapping in half. Mark stepped inside, his grin now replaced with a cold, menacing glare. Jessie raised the knife, her hands trembling. "Stay back," she whispered. Mark shook his head slowly. "You're not going to use that." He took a step closer. Jessie tightened her grip on the knife, her heart racing. "I will, I swear." Mark smirked. "No, you won't." He lunged. Jessie screamed, slashing the knife wildly. It caught Mark across the arm, making him stumble back with a growl of pain. Blood dripped from the cut, staining his shirt. "Ouch!" he hissed, clutching his arm. Jessie didn't wait. She bolted past him, out of the cabin and into the night. But as she ran, her phone buzzed one last time. She glanced down at the screen. "You're almost there. Keep running." Her heart pounded as she sprinted through the dark forest, Mark's enraged shouts echoing behind her. She didn't know who had sent the messages. She didn't know if help was really coming, but she wasn't going to stop. Not until she was safe. Jessie ran through the forest, her legs burning with exhaustion and her lungs screaming for air. The dark trees seemed endless, twisting and turning, making it impossible to tell which direction she was going. Every step felt heavier, but she didn't dare slow down. Behind her, Mark's enraged shouts echoed through the trees, his footsteps crashing through the underbrush. "Jessie!" he bellowed, his voice wild with fury. "You think you can get away? You're only making it worse." Jessie's phone buzzed again. She glanced at the screen, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. Another message from the unknown number. "Don't stop. The road is close." Her heart skipped a beat. She glanced around desperately, but all she saw were trees and shadows. No sign of a road. No sign of escape. Was someone really guiding her? Or was this another cruel trick? The sound of a branch snapping made her head snap back. Mark was getting closer. She could hear him crashing through the forest, his heavy footsteps relentless. Jessie forced herself to keep going, pushing past the pain in her legs. She ducked under low-hanging branches, weaving through the trees. Her mind raced with questions. Who was sending the messages? How did they know where she was? And, most importantly, could she trust them? Suddenly, the forest opened up into a clearing. Jessie skidded to a stop, her chest heaving. In the center of the clearing was something she hadn't expected. A white van. The same white van she had seen parked near the cabin earlier. Her blood ran cold. The van's headlights were off, but the engine was running, humming softly in the still night air. Jessie's phone buzzed again. She looked down, dreading what she would see. "Get inside." Her heart pounded in her chest. Number. There was no way she was getting in that van. Behind her, Mark's footsteps grew louder. "Jessie!" His voice was closer now, filled with rage and desperation. She turned back toward the trees, trying to decide whether to run or hide, but before she could move, the van's back door swung open, revealing a figure inside. A man. His face was shadowed, but his voice was calm and steady. "Jessie," he said softly. "It's safe. Get in." Jessie froze. Her instinct screamed at her to run. but something about the man's tone made her hesitate. He wasn't shouting like Mark. He wasn't frantic or angry. He sounded calm, reassuring. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling. The man didn't answer. He just gestured to the van. "You're not safe out here. He's coming. Get in." Jessie glanced back toward the forest. Mark's footsteps were getting closer, crashing through the underbrush like a wild animal. She made her decision. Jessie ran to the van, climbing inside just as Mark burst into the clearing. "Jessie, don't!" he shouted, sprinting toward the van. The man slammed the door shut, locking it with a heavy thunk. Mark pounded on the side of the van, his fist slamming against the metal. "Open the door!" he screamed. "She's mine!" The man didn't flinch. He shifted the van into gear and drove forward, leaving Mark behind, screaming into the night. Jessie sat in the back of the van, trembling, her heart still racing. The man glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his expression unreadable. "Who are you?" she asked again, her voice barely above a whisper. The man was silent for a long moment before finally speaking. "I've been tracking him for a while," he said. "You're not the first woman he's done this to." Jessie's stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" The man sighed. "Mark's been luring women into the woods for years. He's careful. He moves from place to place, changes his name. He never leaves behind evidence, until now." Jessie's hands shook as she processed his words. "Why are you helping me?" The man glanced at her again. "Because someone has to." Her phone buzzed once more. Jessie looked down at the screen, her heart skipping a beat. It was another message from the unknown number. "You're safe now. For now." Jessie's blood ran cold. She looked up at the man, her voice trembling. "Who's sending these messages?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he drove on, deeper into the night. Back in the clearing, Mark stood alone, his breathing ragged. His hands trembled with fury as he watched the van disappear into the distance. But then, slowly, he smiled. Pulling out his phone, he opened a message thread labeled Unknown Contact. A single text appeared on the screen. "We'll meet again. Next time, she won't be so lucky."